Díomh Carja, agus gur míle mai agus teachta Seanacht, de Fáilte Mór Óglaigh. You're all very welcome here tonight. We're all here at the start of this 25 years anniversary of the events that took place in Gibraltar, which were then delayed on to even more other events which were tragic as well. At that time, whenever our 3 comrades were executed in Gibraltar, it was necessary that someone go out and have the onerous task of bringing home the bodies of Mairead, Sean and Dan, and that person is here beside me tonight, Joe Austin. So I'm going to ask Joe if he just wants to begin telling us how those events unfolded for him and what was the sequence that was to begin his journey. So Joe, if I could ask you, how did it all begin for you at that time?
Well, like all Republicans, I then and now would be, and like yourself, I would be a constant news listener, reading papers, or always, particularly at that time, always trying to find out what's happening, if anything's developed. And at about 6 o'clock on the Sunday evening, I listened to the Channel 4 news. And the first reports that interrupted the news bulletin was that there had been a gun battle on the Rock of Gibraltar, and a number of people had been injured and captured. My first reaction, given that I had obviously no prior knowledge, and given where Gibraltar was, and given that the Basques had been quite active on what they would call mainland Spain, my first reaction was that it's probably Basques. The news started to change subtly within the next hour, and it then looked for a period that it was perhaps Palestinians, but they still carried the story of a gun battle, of a number of injured and a number of people captured. About perhaps 7:30, 8 o'clock, I was visited by a senior Republican to tell me that it was volunteers. The story wasn't quite clear whether all of the volunteers had been shot, captured or executed, but there certainly was casualties, and that other Republicans were in the process of informing the families. My first thought was, who haven't they seen? Who's missing? Who hasn't been about? And I didn't know who it was, but I knew I would know, as we all would know. We would know volunteers. Your mind is racing as to who you haven't seen, or who hasn't been around. About 8:30, 9:15, Danny Morrison arrived to tell me that it was Dan and Sean and Mairead, and that we were going to Dan's house, and we were doing a meeting. Peter Hartley, who's in the hall today, had been with the family and trying to find out and trying to kind of do in the short term what could be done. And we went to Dan's house, and obviously the family were distraught. It was agreed that we would go to PJ McCrory's house sometime that night. It still wasn't clear, but it was clear that they were dead. But it wasn't clear, the circumstances weren't clear. And nor from my point of view was it clear that anybody had escaped or whether people were captured. The news was still confused. And it wasn't so much that the Brits hadn't got the story. It was the Brits were pumping out, bomb captured, gun battle, soldiers maybe injured, civilians in the scene. All of that was rattling around. And we now know why it was rattling around. It was rattling around because they were preparing the ground for what they would say in terms of the media, because it was summary execution. A number of us, Jerry Adams, Tom Hartley, myself, Danny Morrison, the Savages, the McCanns, and one of the Farrells, travelled to PJ McCrory's house, where PJ had been making whatever efforts he could to find out, and it still wasn't clear, but at least what we knew, unfortunately, was that those executions had taken place. It was agreed, because it was the best way to proceed, it was agreed that we would go, and we, being a collective, we would go to Gibraltar. We would try and redeem the bodies. How we were going, when we were going, who was going, by no means was decided. There's a long-standing Republican tradition that actually goes back to the Féin's, both here in England and in America, that fallen comrades are escorted for all of, or most of, the journey home. And it was then decided that we would need someone representing the movement to travel with the families, and they would return to Ireland with the bodies. So later on that night, and there were meetings going on continually through most of the night and all of it, it was later decided that I would go. And I have to say that it was a tremendous honour. It was a privilege to go, an unfortunate privilege. I should say this, and just in keeping, of the 3 volunteers, and I said earlier on to remember how they lived, of the 3 volunteers I knew Don and Sean the best. I knew Mairead. I didn't know her particularly well. I knew her, and I knew her from Republican work. Don McCann was a unique character. To say that he was committed is an understatement. And there are people here who work with him, and they tell that story better than me. But he was a committed Republican. He was a brave, a daring Republican. When the Brits put the story out that these 3 people were a serious threat, they were right. They were absolutely right. They'd got it right. They were a threat. Sean Savage was something else. And Peter Rooney's here, and he could maybe tell, as I say, more stories than me. I never in my life met anyone more argumentative than Sean Savage. If you had a discussion, and I had many discussions about the most abstract things, Sean Savage, to win his point, would go and get a book out of the library and come back for round 2. You never won an argument. At best, you were neutral. He had the most inquisitive mind that I have ever experienced in my whole life, in the movement and outside of the movement. He could do anything. He could invent anything. He knew a wee bit about everything, to be so young. So what they were remarkable people, and they were the threat. If the Brits told any truths around the Gibraltar assassinations, when they said these people are a threat, they were absolutely right, because they were a threat. It was agreed sometime in the early hours of the morning that I would go. The families, you have to understand, and you do understand, but the families had just learned that they were dead. That's bad enough, but to be dead and so far away, it was such a traumatic experience. And for genuine reasons and just physical reasons, it was agreed that one family was too old, another family was too well, another family, that myself and Mairead's brother would go. And we would go the next day, which was the 7th. It was suggested that I would have, on behalf, it was agreed, suggested by PJ McCrory, and agreed that I would have the power of attorney to act on the behalf of the family. And that power of attorney would be duplicated. And it was duplicated on the basis that it was likely that I, or any Republican, get into Gibraltar would be arrested, so that there would be no unnecessary or unforeseen delay, that I would have it and Mairead's brother would have it. That afternoon, the afternoon of our departure, because a lot of things had to be organised, for instance, in the practicalities of it, we had to get an undertaker who would get his coffins. It's simple as that. We tried to get a solicitor. Undertakers are paired both in any given country. They're paired with someone locally. PJ McCrory tried to get us a solicitor, and he failed. We couldn't get a solicitor in Gibraltar who would deal with us and deal with the families through us. We managed to get an undertaker, and the undertaker was got through Margaret Healy. And I have to say that there are many people who are the unsung heroes of Gibraltar, and the Healy family are one of them. They done that, and they also played a big factor in the journey home in Ireland. We left Ireland that night, came away not knowing what to expect. We flew to Malaga, where we had pre-booked a car. When we arrived off the plane to Malaga, we were surrounded by Spanish cops, by the Spanish branch, by what they call allegedly anti-terrorists. This whole entourage of cops, government officials, press, people who were in the airport had seen this scrum. It was just a melee, and it was like walking through quicksand. The more we walked, the more the crowd got. When we went to collect the car, the people who hire cars told us that they didn't hire their cars to terrorists. So round one, we're grounded in Malaga, and we have to travel that journey to Gibraltar. In the middle of all of this, there was a man who described himself, who's English, and who described himself as being from the ministry. And he was to reappear at every major event that went along the way into all of that. We eventually did get the car through his intervention. I think more to get rid of us and more to be in control of us rather than more to be helpful. We travelled from Malaga down that highway down to, with a whole entourage of journalists in tow. Just a long motorway, and there would have been no opportunity to lose them. They just came, and you've all seen these things on television. They were trying to overtake us, and cameras out the window, and cameras rolling and cutting in, and the motorway is particularly dangerous anyway, and they made it more dangerous. We scouted about when we came to a place called La Linea, which is the Spanish for the line, which is the next Spanish town before you cross into Gibraltar. And we came away tried to get a bit of respite. By this stage, it was dark, and we drove around trying to lose them, and we actually did, we thought, lost this posse of journalists. We went to the crossing, and at the crossing, there was a border dispute with Gibraltar and with the Spanish. When we got to the crossing, there always is, but there was an abnormally long tail of traffic, and we were at the back of a long tail of traffic. In front of us was substantial numbers of Gibraltar police who dressed like Dixon of Dock Green or like London bobbies, and around them there was hundreds of journalists. We sat in the car. Our car was immediately approached by a senior Gibraltarian cop who took us out of the car and brought us across the border crossing to a different angle, to a small administration office, which was really quite tiny. When he opened the door, it was like a sardine can. There was just a team of people who were squished into it, and we were the last two to go into it. They were Gibraltarians, cops, they were British Ministry of Defence, they were lawyers, they were all kinds of officials, and they began, as you can imagine, to tell us what we would do and what we couldn't do, how we would proceed and who we would talk to. When we met the press, we would wear blankets over our heads. We would do what we were told, and all of that.
Joe, the way you're telling the story, it's clear that you were in a very hostile environment, and it must have been really, really intimidating. How did you actually feel? Was it frightening? Did you feel like your lives were in danger?
No, I didn't. I was there to do, and this isn't to sound any sense of bravado, because I'm not, but I was there to do something that I had been asked to do, and I was very aware that it was a privilege. I was very aware that I was representing the families. I was very aware that these people killed my friends. So I wasn't frightened by them, and I wasn't intimidated by them. And I knew enough from the stories in the blocks, I knew enough to know that officialdom thrives when you give it the right to intimidate you. So what we'd done, and we had agreed we would do it, we were two cheeky Belfast Republicans and that's what we were, and that's how we behaved. They produced a whole bunch of files and documents and all of that they wanted us to sign, and terms that we should agree to. I had told them that we wanted, first of all, we wanted to see the remains. That was the first thing we wanted to do. And we would do nothing, we'd say nothing until that happened. I produced the documents that allowed me to be identified as the attorney on behalf, with the power of attorney on behalf of the families. And after some discussion, they agreed that we would go in their convoy to the naval base. The naval base is built into the mountain, and these are tunnels that foreseen many, many wars, but they were most effective during the Second World War, when the siege of Gibraltar by the German Luftwaffe. They tunnelled into the mountain, and so these tunnels run for what appears to be miles, and they run right through that. You see that the rock, they're right in below the rock, they're right through the rock. Gibraltar, for anybody that's been there, is the very narrow streets. It considers itself very quaintly British, and so even two cars past each other slow down. It's very narrow. It's bedecked by Union Jacks. The pubs are British pubs. Everything about Gibraltar wants to be British. So when we left for the convoy, it was clear, and also because this was an international story, also because they had been mobilised. The Gibraltarian loyalists were out on the street, and they made sure that we knew where their loyalties lie. So we came through this chicane of people on the street, and we eventually got to the naval base, which Gibraltar is quite small, but it's a strange kind of layout. So you're not travelling a great distance, but it takes a while. When we got to the naval base, we were met by the senior naval officer, who identified himself, told me, that we wouldn't be allowed on the base. We were if that was the security barrier, we were immediately on the other side of it, that we would have to sign the Official Secrets Act before we would be admitted to the base, and we refused and said we wouldn't sign it. And there was a standoff then for a period. They buckled, and they admitted us to the base. They brought us to the place where the mortuary was, kept us outside in a kind of a courtyard, and they went away. And while they were away, we discussed what we would do. It was agreed that I would go in alone and identify the bodies. And if I thought it was possible that Mairead's brother would then come in, but that I would go in first. The naval officer returned to escort us, in this case it was me, back through these tunnels into where the mortuaries were. And it's a surreal experience. It's literally is like walking through a mountain. They're badly lit, they're dimly lit, and you're walking quite a distance. They're carved out of rock. So it's that eerie, gothic feeling about it. We got to a small room, and there were many small rooms, but we went to the room where we were going to, and it turned out to be the mortuary. The naval officer told me his words, "Steady yourself. This is the mortuary." And we went in. Dan McCann, well, a body was on the floor, wrapped in cellophane, large sheet of cellophane, just almost thrown over it. And he removed it, and it was Dan, and he had been shot, obviously shot, badly shot. The remains are Dan, hadn't been cleaned, no preparation had been made to prepare the family, if that had been the people who were there, to prepare for the identification. As I'm looking at Dan, and I said, "It's Dan McCann," and he said, "How do you know them?" And I said, "Because he's my friend. That's how I know him." As I'm doing that, he, without looking and without pausing, opened what I can only describe as a large filing cabinet, and in that Sean was there. And Sean was in the same condition, and I identified Sean. I asked where Mairead was and was told that she was in an outer room and he would bring me to her. The outer room was only literally feet away, and he done that. Mairead, unlike Sean or Dan, was on a bed. There were candles lit beside the bed, and she had a sheet up to her throat. There's some effort had been taken to clean whatever facial wounds there were, although her nose seemed to have been broken. And I asked him how this injury had occurred, and he told me he didn't know. We were later told by the undertaker that it was as a result of the bullet wounds to the back, propelling her forward, pushing her forward. And we left. And when we got out, I went back to this corridor again. I talked to Mairead's brother and said that in my opinion that he should go in and he should formally identify Mairead. And he did. On the way to it, and this is a story about things that probably don't have a lot of meaning or explanation now, 25 years later, but they did at the time. Further down one of these corridors, but not connected to the corridor that we were travelling in, this figure came almost gliding down the corridor, almost flapping down the corridor towards us. And it looked like a ghost, I have to say, it looked like a ghost. And when we stopped, I realised that it was a monk. It was a monk coming down. And he got down and he described himself, dressed like an old-fashioned monk. He described himself as a padre for the naval base. And he asked could he accompany us in and could he pray in the mortuary with us. Mairead's brother said no. And I asked for a moment for us to be together. And I said to him, you know, we're here and we're here on behalf of all the families. You need to think, what would your mother or father want? What would Dan's wife want? You know, what do you think? Think for them as well as thinking for us. And he then said, well, yes, okay. So the three of us went into the room where Mairead was and we prayed. Well, I didn't pray, I have to say, they prayed. And we left, and on the way down the corridor, he said, I need to tell you this is important. We didn't kill them. They came by plane, they committed murder, and they left. And that was a sentiment that was repeated over and over and over and over again. We eventually left from there in convoy to meet the undertaker, who we hadn't met. We hadn't had a time. It's 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at this stage. When we got there was the same grouping of journalists and press and all of that. We're in a car that's been driven by a Gibraltarian cop. We stopped only because we couldn't get into the street, very narrow street, big large crowds, Gibraltarians out hurling abuse. But when we got to the undertaker's, he stopped some distance away and without looking gave us 2 blankets and told us without looking or without asking to put them over our heads. And you can imagine what we told him to do with the blankets. We went in, we met the undertaker. There are many heroes of Gibraltar. The undertaker was one of them. The undertaker, because almost as soon as we got home, his business was closed down. The undertaker explained the difficulties. He alerted us, which we should have thought of but didn't. He alerted us to the fact that the whole staff, employees around the aerodrome were Gibraltarian loyalists. And he predicted, rightly so, that we would have difficulty with them. But he said that once the formal identification had been done, that he would then go that night and he would supply coffins and he would line the coffins. He also advised us, you're here for a while. You're going to be here for quite a while. Within a wee while of that, we left to go back to La Linea. We found a small hotel. We went, it was quite late on, early hours of the morning. We booked in, parked the car booked in, got a room, went in, and then started making contact with Ireland. And again, you know, it's 25 years ago. And you keep on telling me I'm old-fashioned. There was no mobile phones. You know, you weren't able to, any contact you had, it was routed through the hotel phone. There was a team of people who, again, people maybe don't know about, who were in Ireland, who were trying to secure contact with the Spanish authorities, trying to get contact, you know, just to set up all the things that had to be done, trying to get the Free State government to intervene, trying to get amnesty, trying to do all those. And there were Ted Hall, Tom Hartley, Danny Morrison, and R.G. Macaulay. And they're the heroes. They're the heroes. We just exhausted, emotionally, physically exhausted. We decided we would go to bed. Got into bed, the door rapped. The owner of the hotel asked, could we come down and speak to him and his wife? This is a family hotel, and we asked him why, and he said, we know who you are, and it may not be possible for you to stay here. La Linea is just across the border, as I said earlier on. Gibraltar effectively closes at 10 o'clock. So the squaddies come across into La Linea to go on the tour or to go to nightclubs or whatever, and they were frightened of marauding loyalists. They knew that sooner or later, even though that night it didn't appear that the media knew where we were, they would know by the morning, and that they wanted to take a family decision whether or not we could stay. It turned out they let us stay. We were there. So we went back to bed. A couple of hours into that, the door pounded again by the same man to tell us that the Spanish police were downstairs. They were looking to see what room we were in. They were going to arrest us. And he had delayed them as long as possible, but that we should get dressed. But we were about to be arrested. And of course we were arrested. We were brought from the room. The Spanish cops that were there said they didn't speak English, so they didn't tell us why we were being arrested. But they brought us to a local cop shop, and they put us in a cage in the middle. If you can imagine, like a drunk tank, or one of the things you see in New York police stations, cage, and people are walking around you, and there's a desk and all of that. We were there. Every time we asked to speak to someone in authority, we were told that they didn't have anybody, and they didn't speak English very well, and that was it. And about an hour or 2 hours into this, I could hear a commotion, and it was a very small place in the hall, and the next thing was these 5 or 6 women came tumbling in to the station, and the door of the cage opened, and they got unceremoniously flung into this small holding cell or cage. And I kind of looked at one of them and then another one, and they had moustaches and beards, and they were actually a team of transvestites who had been arrested for soliciting. And you know, so that was that part of it. I at the time smoked, and I'd left, foolishly enough, despite all the time that you have all this, I left the room without cigarettes, and they gave us cigarettes. They translated for us, and they tried to find out what was happening. We were told that we were going to be charged with what we didn't know, but the next morning, and we were going to back to Malaga. No, sorry, we were going to Malaga, I think Malaga, to be arraigned, to be appearing in court. We were held overnight. The following day we were brought to court. When we got to court, we were met at the door of the court by a government official of some sort to tell us that it was a mistake. We were being released. We could go back to our hotel, and not only could we go back to our hotel, but the Spanish were so embarrassed by what the British had done, and also because of the threat from the squaddies, that they were going to give us Spanish bodyguards, and we told them to stick them. I mean, these are people who had acquiesced in the murders. These are people who helped the British carry out the executions, either through surveillance or through intelligence work. So we were back, day one, begun. I don't want to go through it all. You know most of the background. We were told that we wouldn't. We were told that from Ireland that British Airways wouldn't handle the remains. That the Star newspaper were carrying out this campaign. Many were here. Many would have read it. I didn't. That they were carrying out this campaign that they wouldn't remove the remains. So British Airways and all of the other airways, all the other airlines followed suit. They enticed the Gibraltarian workers. They supported the boycott. They refused to reroute the planes. All of that happened. So we were effectively, as far as we could see, we were landlocked. And the real work began. Here in Ireland, people began, many of you began to raise money, began to look for alternative bookings of flights and airlines. And we were told then, this was like at every hour. We've got British Airways, you're going home. No, you're not. We've got Aer Lingus, you're going home. No, you're not. We've got Ryanair, they've changed their mind. The Spanish authorities will let you cross the border. You're going to Morocco. You're going to go to Morocco by boat, and then you're going to fly from. So all of that was going on and going on.
Did it seem, Joe, at any time that you weren't going to succeed, like as if nobody was going
Never.
to acquiesce? What, you just felt like sooner or later?
I'd have died. I never once thought that I wouldn't come home. Not once. I didn't know what it would take. I had absolute faith in the people who were here. I never once thought that we couldn't do it. Ever once. Not for once. Not for 1 minute did I think that we couldn't come home. Long story short, and it is a long story, and your patience is great, but we got a phone call on the night before we left from Tom Hartley to say that they had managed to get a plane in Luton, and the plane would come into Gibraltar. What we had to do is we had to meet the Gibraltarian authorities, and we had to get their permission. As I said when I began, everything in Gibraltar is military, so the runway is an MOD runway, although commercial flights use it. But we had to get their permission to have the remains, have the plane land and load it and leave. And they just were as difficult as they could possibly be. Our people here were using whatever political clout they had in Ireland, whatever clout they had in America, wherever they could find it. And the British authorities eventually agreed. And they agreed for what's called turnaround status, which means the plane comes in, it turns, the propellers keep turning, and you get on the plane, or you load the plane, and you take off. The only stipulation that we had was that it had to be refuelled in Gibraltar. It had the plane that I think it was a turbo that we managed to get, had to be refuelled. We couldn't get the plane. It couldn't travel from Luton to Gibraltar with enough fuel. So that had to happen. And so we were told, this was one of many instructions, we were told the night before we did leave that we're coming in the morning, we're going to be out at 9 o'clock, you need to be on the runway. This plane it can sit down obviously, but it can't hang about. You need to have everything in place. You need to have the undertaker there, you need to have the hearse there, you need to have everything ready to move. An hour before that happened, we got another phone call. An hour after that, we're told that the Gibraltarians wouldn't agree on the type of plane that's wrong. They wouldn't agree on refueling. The Gibraltarian workers wouldn't refuel the plane. And they were trying to get, or our people were trying to get a plane with more fuel capacity. But that we didn't know whether that could be done or not. At this stage we had many kind of, not false alarms, because people were doing all that they could do, but we had that many kind of alerts, be ready, no, you're not going, you are. It was just, okay, all right. But it was faith. It was faith in knowing the people who were doing in Ireland what they had to do, and no better people to do it. At 1 o'clock in the morning, we were told, we've got another plane, 9 o'clock, you're going. Be on the runway at 9, with everything in place. We contacted the undertaker. We also, the offer of Spanish bodyguards, which we rejected, they supplied 2 cops that sat in the foyer and watched us. They weren't bodyguards in any shape or form. But we told them that they had to contact, because it was so late at night, their own authorities and confirm with the Gibraltarians that we could bring the plane in at 9 the following morning. This all went on through the night. They come back to say, yes, you can in, but we won't fuel the plane, but yes, you can come in. At 7 o'clock the following morning, we were brought by them into Gibraltar to meet the undertaker, and we then travelled to the access to the runway, where we were again stopped by the Air Force authorities, the Royal RAF authorities, to be told we wouldn't be allowed to go onto the base unless we signed the Official Secrets Act, which we refused again. And we were then arrested. This time it's 8:30, 20 past 8. We're brought to a guardhouse. We're placed in a guardhouse. For anybody that's fortunate or otherwise of being in Gibraltar, when you stand and look out towards the runway, the mountains behind you, and the planes come in to where the mountain is, they turn and they land and they get ready and they go back the way they came. And we couldn't see there, but there were planes landing. They were commercial planes, they were RAF planes, and every plane that landed was the plane that we missed. We were convinced that the plane had gone, that we weren't getting. At 9:15, they released us and rushed us onto the runway. And when we got there, the undertaker was there with the three coffins. There are huge hangars that face onto the runway, massive hangars, that would house 6, 7 double-decker buses, maybe more. And the doors of these had been almost closed, but opened enough for the Gibraltarian workers to shout abuse and to catcall and to just spit out and all of that sort of stuff. And so against that background, we watched for the plane to come in. And I seen the plane coming. And I don't even know how I knew it was the plane, but I knew it was our plane. It came in, it turned, the propellers ran. The RAF officer who had stopped us came to inform me that there was a secondary problem and that the Gibraltarian workers, this plane's 8-9 foot of the ground, wouldn't load the plane. So we had Dan and Sean and Mairead on the runway. We couldn't get them into the plane. And he asked then, with my permission, would we accept the RAF loading the plane? And one of the hardest decisions of my life, these are the murderers, these are the people that committed the murder. And I agreed that they would load the plane because I had no alternative. And they loaded the plane. There's a film shot, footage of me getting up a set of ladders onto the plane, and I looked round at Mairead's brother. And if you ever get a chance to look at it. There's a lot of people have saw it and have said to me, you just look like you're wrecked. But actually what had happened was, it was Mairead's brother, it was always arranged that I would go home alone. He was never to travel back. And when I looked at him, what I was looking and saying was, we done it. We're on our way home. We done it. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't any of that. It was, we've done it. The plane was piloted by a pilot, co-pilot and the navigator. In the back, it was a 60-seater plane, and the back of the plane, all of the seats had been removed. There was one seat left, and that was the seat I sat on. Dan, Sean and Mairead were strapped in like a cargo in the middle of this, where the aisles of the plane, where the aisles of the seats would have been. And the plane took off. It was terrible, it was very slow. It took us, I think, 5 or 6 hours to get back to Ireland. And I talked to them the whole way back. And I talked to them about what had happened. I talked to them about me. I talked to them about them. I argued with Sean. I'd done all those things, and I talked to them. The people who were the pilots were very respectful and very decent. We eventually were told as we came into Dublin that we weren't going to the normal route. We were going to be rerouted to a part of the airport that isn't used for a commercial purpose. That it's the part of the airport where planes are repaired and work is done. When we landed, we were met by senior guards, and I know some of the people here were there as well. Senior guards and senior customs official, and they explained that they would take over, that they would unload the remains, and I should go to the chapel where the families were and where other members of the movement were, and there was quite a crowd, and I should go there. And I said I wouldn't. I said I would stay until we were home. We had left Gibraltar against this background of people hurling abuse at us and screaming at us and shouting from these huge hangars. And we were about to enter another huge hangar in Dublin where Dublin workers were working. And they're talking maybe a couple of hundred people, and lathes were going, hammers were going. Don, Sean and Mairead were on a trolley, and I was walking with my hand on a coffin. Surrounded, not in an aggressive way, but surrounded by people who were the guards and whatever. And we entered a few feet into this workshop, massive workshop. As I say, people were using machinery and radios were going and all of that. And we had been away at this stage we'd been away for 7 days. And we were tired, and we were emotional, and we were home, and all of that. And your mind kind of plays tricks on you. And I thought I heard in a distance, through all this dim, somebody beginning to pray. And then it just swept the room. And the radios were turned off. And men stopped working. And lathes stopped going. And as somebody started a prayer, somebody down the row answered it. And somebody answered it across the way. And everybody was on their feet. We prayed us, and I'm not a religious person, but they prayed us through this huge workshop till we got to the Chapel of Rest. Brendan Hughes and Joe Cahill had been tasked from that point to take responsibility for the rest of the journey, and we were home. And we all know, everybody here in this room knows, that the remains were hijacked. We all know about the crowds, and some of you were there, and I can see people who were candy way. And the 3 days of the wakes began, and we know about the attacks. But my part of it, which is all I'm here to tell, my part of it was done. I have to say something that I want to say on a personal basis. There's a woman called Carmen Poeta, who was the witness to the murder of Don and Mairead. She saw it from her window. Don died shielding Mairead. Sean was executed some distance away. Carmen Poeta, despite all, and I was just looking at the Star of the Day where they identified her, the Whore of Gibraltar. Carmen Poeta refused to tell lies. Carmen Poeta refused, and you asked me, was I frightened? Carmen Poeta refused to let fear rule her life, and she told the story. Her son, a young boy, a young child, was forced to leave Gibraltar within weeks of her standing up and telling what she saw. Other witnesses were there, and they all buckled. Her husband had to leave for his own safety, Gibraltar. Carmen Poeta told the truth. 25 years ago, on the 20th anniversary, I had a chance of meeting her, and I met her in St Mary's. And getting ready to do what we're doing now, I said to her, through her son, who's now a man, and ironically, he's a lawyer, and I asked him to ask her, why she done it? Why did she tell the truth? And she said, because it was right. That's the only reason. When PJ McCrory went back to do the inquest, he stopped in Spain and he bought a poster, and he brought it with him to the small room that was allocated in the so-called court, which wasn't the court of Gibraltar, where the inquest were to take place. And he put it facing the door that everybody entering his room would see. And it was a poster of a bullfight, of the Hemingway book called Death in the Afternoon. And that's what it was. It was Death in the Afternoon. Thanks for being so patient. Gora míle magat.